The Obsidian Veil. The journey to Blackwood Asylum was less a drive and more a deliberate descent into an older, forgotten world. Elias Thorne's pickup truck, a utilitarian beast of rusted steel and thrumming engine, grumbled its protest as it clawed its way up the final neglected stretch of road. The asphalt had long surrendered to encroaching earth, leaving a scarred track of gravel and mud that chewed at the tires. On either side, the forest pressed in, a dense, suffocating wall of skeletal hardwoods, their branches, devoid of leaves, clawing at the perpetually overcast sky like gnarled, arthritic fingers. No sunlight pierced this canopy, only a bruised gray luminescence filtered down, rendering the entire landscape in shades of charcoal and ash. Elias had come for a story, or perhaps more accurately, for the unsettling whispers that clung to this place like the perpetual mist that now began to coil around the ancient trunks. He was a freelance journalist, drawn to the forgotten corners, the places where history had festered into legend. Blackwood, once a beacon of progressive psychiatric research, had been abandoned abruptly nearly 50 years ago, its dark legacy dissolving into rumor. Experimental therapies, disappearances, the unhinged babble of patients echoing through empty halls. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was not empty, but pregnant, a heavy, velvet blanket that smothered the last echoes of the truck's complaint. The air, crisp and biting, carried the damp scent of decay, of wet earth and something else, something metallic and acrid like old blood or rusted iron. It was a smell that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the trees. He checked his gear, a high-powered flashlight, a sturdy camera with extra batteries, a digital recorder, and a compact first aid kit. His hand brushed against the cold steel of the small utility knife sheathed at his belt, a reflex born of instinct rather than any conscious expectation of danger. Still, the isolation, the sheer crushing weight of the wilderness pressing in, made the gesture feel necessary. The facility itself emerged from the swirling mists like a specter. It wasn't a grand Gothic edifice, but a sprawling, brutalist complex of concrete and stained brick, its stark angles softened by time and neglect. Windows, like vacant eye sockets, stared out from under heavy, sagging eaves. Patches of ivy thick as anaconda oils wrestled with the crumbling facade, pulling stones from their mortar. A rusted iron gate, half off its hinges, groaned faintly in the barely perceptible breeze, a sound like a tortured breath. Above it, a faded sign, mostly obscured by green mold, still bore the faint etching, "Blackwood Psychiatric Research Facility." The word research seemed particularly sinister here, echoing in the mind with implications of cold steel and colder intentions. Elias pushed the gate open. The shriek of tortured metal was deafening in the silence, sending a flock of unseen birds scattering from the trees with a sudden frantic rustle of wings. He flinched, his heart thudding against his ribs. It was merely a gate, he told himself, worn by decades of disuse, but the sound lingered, a ghost note in the air. He stepped onto what was once a paved drive, now a jagged mosaic of cracked concrete and weeds. The main entrance, a cavernous archway, stood agape, its heavy wooden doors having long since rotted away or been forced inward by some forgotten storm. A shroud of perpetual twilight seemed to cling to the threshold, a tangible barrier. Elias paused, drawing a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. The sense of being watched was almost physical, a prickle on the nape of his neck. But when he scanned the surrounding woods, there was nothing but the silent, unyielding trees. He flicked on his flashlight. The powerful beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a wide reception area. Dust motes danced in the artificial light, swirling like microscopic souls caught in a silent maelstrom. The air inside was heavier, stagnant, thick with the scent of damp plaster, mildew, and something else, something indefinable, akin to the faint, sweet decay of old paper and human despair. The silence here was different from the outdoor silence. It was an active silence, a presence that pressed down, absorbing all sound. Even his own footsteps, usually crisp on concrete, seemed muted, swallowed. To his right, a reception desk, its wood warped and splintered, lay overturned. Scattered papers, brittle and yellowed, littered the floor, their ink faded into illegibility. A calendar, stuck to a wall by a single rusted tack, was frozen on a date from half a century ago. October, the month of shadows. Elias moved slowly, methodically, his gaze sweeping over every detail, his recorder discreetly clipped to his lapel, its tiny red light glowing steadily. He spoke in a low murmur, narrating his observations, the sound of his own voice a fragile thread in the oppressive quiet. Main entrance. Looks like it's been open to the elements for decades. Significant water damage. No signs of recent human activity. No graffiti, no squatters. Almost preserved by neglect. He pushed deeper into a long corridor that stretched into absolute darkness. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the oppressive gloom, revealing peeling paint, institutional green walls that bled into gray, and doors lining both sides, each numbered, many ajar. The floor was littered with debris, shattered glass, fallen ceiling tiles, twisted metal conduits. A faint, rhythmic drip echoed from somewhere further down the hall, a tiny, insistent pulse in the monumental silence. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of the building weeping. He chose a door at random, pushing it open further. The room beyond was a small office, furnished with a skeletal desk and a single chair, both overturned. A heavy, leather-bound book lay open on the floor, its pages warped by moisture. Elias knelt, his breath catching in his throat. It was a patient ledger, meticulously kept. Names, dates of admission, diagnoses. His finger traced a line. Patient 417, admitted 1973. Diagnosis, acute schizophrenia with violent tendencies. Treatment, experimental therapy, Unit C. The ink was precise, almost elegant, a chilling contrast to the suffering it documented. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from somewhere above him, making him jump. He spun around, flashlight beams sweeping the ceiling, then the corridor. Nothing. Just the settling of an old building, he told himself, trying to rationalize the jolt of fear that had shot through him. But the sound had been too distinct, too sharp, like a bone snapping. He continued down the corridor, the air growing colder, heavier. He passed what looked like a nurse's station, its counter still littered with rusted instruments, glass vials, and ancient desiccated cotton swabs. The smell of antiseptic, long faded, mingled with the pervasive scent of decay. A shadow, vast and indistinct, seemed to flicker at the very edge of his peripheral vision, just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. He turned his head sharply, but it was gone, absorbed by the darkness. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. He was alone. He had to be. "Just your mind playing tricks, Elias," he muttered, his voice hoarse, a thin reed against the crushing silence. He reached a junction where the main corridor branched into 3 distinct paths. To his left, a sign, half torn and hanging crookedly, read, "Administration." To his right, "Patient wards." Straight ahead, a larger, more ominous sign, its letters almost completely obscured by grime and corrosion, "Research Unit C." The ledger's entry flashed in his mind. Experimental therapy, Unit C. A cold nut tightened in his stomach. This was it. This was where the story lay buried. He chose Unit C. The corridor leading to it was narrower, darker, the air noticeably colder. The walls here were stained with something darker than mildew, a mottled, brownish red that hinted at old spills, or something far more gruesome. The floor was slick in places, not just from water, but from an oily sheen that reflected his flashlight beam with an unsettling gleam. He noticed faint scratches on the concrete walls, long, desperate marks that looked like they'd been made by fingernails, or something sharper. As he moved deeper, he began to hear it, a faint, almost subliminal sound, like wind rustling through dry leaves, but without the wind. It was a low, distant murmur, indistinct and formless, yet undeniably present. It seemed to pulse, to shift, as if 1,000 voices were whispering just beyond the threshold of hearing. Elias paused, straining to identify it. It wasn't a human voice, not exactly, more like the collective sigh of something ancient and tormented. He tightened his grip on his flashlight, his knuckles white. The temperature in the corridor plummeted further, a chill that seeped into his bones, even through his thick jacket. He could see his breath now, pluming faintly in the beam of his light. "Temperature drop," he whispered into his recorder, his voice trembling slightly, significant, unexplained. He pressed on, his footsteps now hesitant, heavy. The whispering grew marginally louder, or perhaps it was just his heightened senses, his fear amplifying every nuance. It seemed to come from the very walls, from the darkness itself. He reached a heavy, reinforced door, different from the others. It was made of thick steel, pitted with rust, and bore no number, only a single faded symbol etched into its surface, a stylized, interlocking set of circles, vaguely alchemical, vaguely occult. He pushed against the door. It didn't budge. A cold dread settled in his chest. This door was meant to keep things in. Or keep things out. He ran his hand along the cold steel, feeling the deep gouges in its surface, and then he felt it. A faint vibration, a low thrumming that resonated through the metal into his palm. It was deep, guttural, almost infrasonic, a sound felt more than heard, like the distant rumble of a massive, confined beast. It vibrated up his arm, settling in his skull, a pressure behind his eyes. Suddenly, from just beyond the door, a sharp, metallic clink echoed, undeniably clear, undeniably close. It sounded like a heavy chain dragged briefly across a concrete floor. Elias froze. His breath hitched in his throat. The whispering intensified, rising in pitch, becoming a distorted, almost angry chorus, the voices no longer subliminal, but pressing in, surrounding him. He could feel unseen eyes on him, a weight of malevolent attention. He wasn't alone. He hadn't been alone since he first stepped through the gate. His flashlight beam flickered, dimmed for a heart-stopping second, then blazed back to full power. But the brief interruption had been enough. In that split second of near darkness, he had caught it, a fleeting glimpse of something in the periphery of his light, a dark, hunched shape, too tall, too gaunt, pressed against the far wall of the corridor, receding into the gloom as the light returned. A guttural sound, a low, animalistic growl, vibrated through the steel door, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in the bone of his skull. It was not human. It was ancient, primal, and filled with a chilling, boundless rage. Elias stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, falling hard onto the slick, cold floor. His recorder, still clipped to his jacket, scraped against the concrete. His flashlight clattered from his grip, rolling across the floor, its beam spinning wildly, painting terrifying, fleeting images on the walls. The claw marks, the dark stains, the swirling dust, and for a fraction of a second, an unholy, elongated shadow that stretched from the reinforced door, reaching for him. He scrabbled backward, his heart a frantic hummingbird in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were a deafening roar now, a tempest of tormented voices, pressing in, tearing at the edges of his sanity. The low growl from beyond the door deepened, growing louder, closer, shaking the very foundations of the facility. He could hear it now, clearly, the dragging of something heavy and metallic, scraping, clinking, then a wet, squelching sound, growing closer, closer. Panic seized him, cold and absolute. He pushed himself to his feet, eyes wide, breath ragged, fumbling for his dropped flashlight. He had come for a story. He had found something far older, far darker, something that had been waiting, and it knew he was here. Part 2. Elias scrambled, his breath tearing in his throat, the metallic clink and wet squelch from beyond the steel door echoing the frantic beat of his own heart. His flashlight lay a few feet away, its beam a chaotic beacon on the grimy floor, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and warped, each one a phantom limb reaching for him. The guttural growl deepened, vibrating through the concrete, through his very bones, a sound of ancient, boundless hunger. And the whispers, they were no longer a distant murmur, but a frenzied cacophony, 1,000 tormented voices screaming just at the edge of his hearing, a storm of anguish threatening to shatter his sanity. He lunged for the flashlight, his fingers closing around the cold metal just as the low thrumming from the reinforced door intensified, rattling the very air. He snatched it up, spinning, the powerful beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. In the brief, terrifying moment before his light settled, he caught it again, not a shadow, but a distinct, hunched form at the far end of the corridor, pressed against the stained wall, impossibly tall, unnaturally gaunt. It seemed to shimmer, to absorb the light, then receded, dissolving into the deeper gloom like smoke. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, remained, a cold hand clamped around his throat. The clinking and squelching sounds behind the steel door grew louder, closer, accompanied by a low, rasping breath, like something struggling to draw air through a constricted throat. The heavy door itself began to creak, a slow, agonizing groan, as if something immense was pressing against it from the inside. Panic, raw and unthinking, flooded Elias. This wasn't a story anymore, it was survival. He didn't wait, didn't rationalize. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the slick floor, the sound of his own desperate footsteps a thunderclap in the suffocating silence. He didn't look back, he couldn't. The whispers pursued him, a swirling vortex of sound, a legion of damned souls clinging to his heels. He burst out of the Unit C corridor and into the main junction, gasping for air, lungs burning. The signs for administration and patient wards loomed, stark in the beam of his light. Unit C was a dead end behind him, a gaping maw of darkness. He couldn't go back that way. He needed an exit, any exit. The main entrance seemed miles away, a distant memory of safety. His gaze flickered to the patient ward sign. It wasn't the way out, but it was away from whatever monstrosity was stirring in Unit C. A desperate gamble. He veered right into the patient wing. This corridor was different, less industrial, more intimate in its decay. Rows of doors, many ajar, lined both sides. The air here was thicker, heavy with the phantom scent of sickness, disinfectant, and something cloyingly sweet like fading flowers or decaying flesh. The silence, initially, was profound, a stark contrast to the cacophony he'd fled. But it was a fragile silence, pregnant with unspoken horrors. Elias moved cautiously, his flashlight sweeping each room as he passed. Most were small, sterile cells containing only rusted bed frames, some with the remnants of leather restraints still buckled to their posts, desiccated and brittle. The walls were covered in faded, childish drawings, crude stick figures, distorted faces, menacing suns, etched into the plaster, some smeared with what looked like old blood or dried mud. A sudden sharp click echoed from one of the rooms behind him. Elias froze, spinning around, his flashlight beam trembling. The door to room 107, which he was certain had been ajar, was now firmly shut. He stared at it, his mind racing, trying to conjure a natural explanation. A draft, the building settling, but there was no draft, and the click had been too deliberate, too sharp. "Hello?" he called out, his voice a pathetic croak in the vast emptiness. No answer, just the heavy, watchful silence. He backed away slowly, his eyes glued to the closed door, then continued his frantic survey of the corridor. The whispers began to return, faint at first, then growing, not the furious roar of Unit C, but a softer, more insidious chorus. They seemed to come from inside the rooms, from behind the closed doors, a fragmented tapestry of whimpers, choked sobs, and low, incoherent babbling. He found himself in what must have been a common room or day area. The space was larger, dominated by overturned tables and chairs, their splintered wood suggesting violent upheaval. In one corner, a child's rocking horse, painted a cheerful blue, lay on its side, one of its wooden eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A chill, colder than any he'd felt so far, swept through the room, raising goosebumps on his arms. His flashlight beam fell upon a collection of objects on a shattered bookshelf. A few tattered storybooks, a broken doll with a missing eye, and a stack of patient files. He snatched one, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. It was brittle, the paper yellowed and crinkling. Patient 214, age 8, admitted 1974. Diagnosis, childhood disintegrative disorder, manifesting as severe catatonia and intermittent violent outbursts. Notes, subject exhibits extreme fear of darkness and confined spaces. Frequently speaks of the tall man in the shadows during lucid periods. Elias's blood ran cold. The tall man in the shadows. The phrase echoed in his mind, linking to the gaunt, shimmering form he'd glimpsed. A child's nightmare, preserved in bureaucratic prose. A low, guttural moan drifted from the adjacent corridor, a sound of profound misery and physical pain. It was not human, not entirely. It had a hollow, echoing quality, as if it emanated from a bottomless void. Elias dropped the file, his gaze snapping to the source of the sound. He crept towards it, curiosity warring with terror, his journalist's instinct still stubbornly alive amidst the panic. The sound led him to a narrow, lightless passage, even darker than the previous corridors. The air here was thick with the smell of rust and stagnant water. He pushed through a swinging door marked hydrotherapy, its paint peeling in strips. The room beyond was cavernous and oppressive. In the center stood a series of ancient claw-footed bathtubs, stained with rust and algae, some still partially filled with dark, murky water. The walls were covered in a sickly green tile, slick with moisture. The moan grew louder here, originating from the far end of the room, near a raised platform that held what looked like a contraption of pipes and chains. As Elias advanced, his flashlight beam illuminating the dreadful scene, he noticed something in one of the bathtubs. Not a person, but something submerged, barely visible beneath the opaque surface. He edged closer, his stomach churning. It was a doll, a large, life-size doll, its porcelain face cracked and discolored, its synthetic hair matted with grime. Its one remaining glass eye stared up at him from the murky depths, a silent, accusatory gaze. And then he heard it clearly, distinctly, from just behind him. A soft, wet plop. He spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. The door he'd entered through was still ajar. But the water in the bathtub closest to him, which had been perfectly still, now rippled. And a faint, distorted voice, barely a whisper, emanated from the doll in the tub, rising from the murky water. He saw me. Elias stumbled back, tripping over a loose tile. The voice was breathy, ancient, filled with an indescribable sorrow. It seemed to come from within him, from the very core of his dread. The temperature in the hydrotherapy room plummeted. His breath plumed violently. The moaning from the far end of the room swelled, becoming a chorus of agony, as if a multitude of unseen patients were being subjected to unimaginable torment. The chains on the platform began to rattle, slowly at first, then with increasing violence, clanking against the metal pipes with a terrible rhythmic clang. And from the shadows at the very edge of his flashlight beam, a new sound began to emerge, a low, guttural gurgle, like water being forced through a dying throat. It was closer than the moan, closer than the chains, emanating from the darkest corner of the room, just behind the row of tubs. Elias pointed his light, hand shaking uncontrollably. The gurgling intensified, accompanied by a heavy, deliberate scrape against the wet tile floor, like something massive being dragged. He could discern movement now, a shifting of shadows, a growing density in the absolute blackness. He squeezed his eyes shut for a terrifying second, then forced them open. His flashlight beam, now unwavering, fell upon it. It was impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs appearing to be jointed in impossible ways. Its skin, or what looked like skin, was stretched taut over a skeletal frame, slick and glistening as if perpetually wet. Its head was small, almost shrunken, yet its jaw seemed distended, its mouth a gaping maw from which the gurgling sound emanated. But it was the eyes that froze Elias to his core, 2 points of pinprick light deep set within the gaunt face, radiating an ancient, unfathomable malevolence. It was the tall man in the shadows, and it was no longer just a shadow, it was real. It was dragging something, a heavy, rusted metal contraption, vaguely chair-like, with thick, ancient leather straps hanging from it. And on the seat of the contraption, slumped forward, was a figure, small, child-sized. A horrifying realization ripped through Elias, the sounds of chains, the squelching, the growling from Unit C. This creature had been there, with its captive. The tall, wet figure began to move towards him, slowly, deliberately, dragging its awful burden, its gurgling breath filling the room, obliterating all other sounds. The small, slumped figure on the chair seemed to stir slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. Elias let out a choked cry, a sound of pure terror. He turned to run, but his feet caught on something unseen. He pitched forward, falling directly into one of the murky bathtubs, the icy, putrid water swallowing him whole. He thrashed, gasping, the water filling his mouth, the metallic taste of rust and decay choking him. His flashlight, still clutched in his hand, plunged with him, its beam twisting wildly beneath the surface, illuminating fleeting, monstrous shapes in the depths of the water before it sputtered and died, plunging the room into absolute, impenetrable darkness. The gurgling sound was right above him now, accompanied by the heavy clink scrape of the dragged contraption. He could feel a cold, wet presence in the water with him, reaching. His lungs burned, his limbs flailed, but the darkness was absolute, the water a suffocating shroud. And from the darkness, a voice, deep and resonant, yet undeniably wet, whispered his name. Elias. Part 3. The icy, putrid water of the bathtub swallowed Elias whole, a liquid grave. His flashlight, his only beacon, sputtered and died, plunging the hydrotherapy room into an absolute, crushing darkness. The cold, metallic taste of rust and decay filled his mouth, choking him as he thrashed wildly, disoriented, lungs burning for air. His ears, submerged, amplified the gurgling sound that was now directly above him, a wet, guttural symphony of death. And then, from the blackness, a voice, deep and resonant, yet undeniably wet, a sound of slick stone and churning depths, whispered his name. Elias. It wasn't a question, but a declaration, a cold, alien recognition that pierced through the suffocating terror, chilling him to his very soul. How could it know his name? The thought, raw and terrifying, momentarily paralyzed him. He was no longer just a trespasser. He was known, observed, perhaps even expected. The whisper lingered, a vibration in the water, in the very marrow of his bones. He felt a disturbance in the water beside him, a sudden, powerful displacement, as if something immense had just entered the tub. A cold, wet hand, impossibly long and skeletal, brushed against his arm, then tightened, its grip like iron bands. Panic, pure and unadulterated, surged through him, eclipsing all rational thought. He screamed, a sound swallowed by the water, and thrashed with the strength of desperation, kicking out, blindly striking at whatever held him. His foot connected with something hard, yielding, and the grip on his arm loosened, then released. He broke the surface, gasping, sucking in ragged gulps of air that tasted of mildew and fear. The darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against his eyes, his skin, his mind. He could hear the creature's gurgling breath, closer now, impossibly close, a sound of waterlogged lungs and ancient malice. The clink-scrape of the dragged contraption reverberated from the tiled floor, moving, shifting, surrounding him. He clawed at the slick, tiled edge of the tub, muscles screaming in protest, propelling himself upward. His hands, numb with cold and terror, found purchase, and he scrambled out, collapsing onto the wet floor with a choked sob. His body, soaked and shivering, felt impossibly heavy, each breath a struggle. The absolute darkness was a physical entity, pressing in, stealing his bearings. He was adrift in a sea of nothingness, surrounded by unseen horrors. The whispers returned, a swirling vortex of indistinct voices, rising and falling in waves of torment and anguish. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, the ceiling, the very air itself. And beneath them, the incessant gurgle of the creature, a relentless, predatory sound, moving, always moving. Elias pressed himself against the cold, wet tiles, trying to orient himself, to remember which way was the door. His eyes, wide and useless, strained against the void. He fumbled for his utility knife, his fingers clumsy, drawing the cold steel from its sheath. It was a pathetic defense against an unseen nightmare, but it was all he had. A faint, almost imperceptible drip, drip, drip echoed from somewhere close, the sound of water falling, perhaps from a faucet, perhaps from something more horrifying. He crawled forward on hands and knees, the cold seeping into his joints, guided only by the sound, hoping it would lead him to a wall, a point of reference.
His hands swept across the floor, encountering slick grime, fallen plaster, then something soft and yielding. He recoiled, heart lurching, before realizing it was just a piece of sodden fabric. He reached a wall, his fingers brushing against the cold, slimy tiles. He pulled himself up, using the wall as a guide, shuffling forward, his senses screaming for any hint of light, any escape.
The gurgling breath of the creature seemed to follow him, a constant, chilling presence just behind his shoulder, or perhaps directly in front, or even above him. It was a phantom, an omnipresent dread. He shuffled along the wall, his hand encountering a doorframe. Hope flared, a fleeting ember in the crushing darkness. He pushed. The door swung inward with a faint, rusty groan. He stumbled through, into what felt like another long corridor. The air here was marginally drier, but colder, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood and disinfectant. He was no longer in the hydrotherapy room, but the oppressive darkness remained. The whispers, however, changed. They became more distinct, individual voices, hushed and frantic, like patients trying to communicate through prison walls.
Don't let it find you. It feeds on despair. The black water, it calls. Elias stumbled forward, the voices weaving a tapestry of torment around him, their words chilling him more than the cold itself. He imagined skeletal figures in the darkness, their eyes wide with perpetual terror, spectral hands reaching out to warn or to drag him down. He felt a sudden sharp pain in his shin, tripping over something low. He fell, scraping his hands on the rough floor. As he lay there, gasping, a faint, pulsing light flickered in the distance, down the corridor. It was weak, intermittent, but it was light. A desperate surge of adrenaline propelled him forward, crawling, then stumbling to his feet, driven by the primal need for illumination.
He half ran, half stumbled towards the light, the whispers growing more frantic now, as if warning him away from it. No, the light, it deceives! But he couldn't heed them. The darkness was a living thing, and the light, however faint, was a promise of escape, a fragile thread to sanity. The light pulsed from an open doorway, revealing a room that solidified the whisper's warnings into stark, horrifying reality. It was an operating theater, or what remained of one. A massive, rusted surgical table dominated the center, its surface stained with ancient, dark patches that looked like dried blood. Around it, surgical instruments lay scattered on the floor, glinting dully in the dim, pulsing light. The light source itself was horrifying. A single, bare bulb, hanging precariously from a frayed wire, swung slowly, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and contracted like living things. But it wasn't just swinging, it was pulsing, flickering with a grotesque rhythm, illuminating the room in strobing flashes of macabre detail. And with each pulse of light, Elias saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. In the brief moments of illumination, he saw figures, not solid corporeal beings, but translucent, shimmering forms, like specters caught between worlds. They were clad in what looked like surgical gowns, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, their mouths agape in silent screams. They were tied down, strapped to the operating table, to gurneys, to chairs, their translucent forms struggling against invisible restraints. And on the floor, scattered amidst the instruments, were what looked like discarded organs, faintly glowing, pulsating with the same rhythm as the light bulb. One of the spectral figures, a woman with long dark hair, was strapped to the surgical table, her head twisted unnaturally to the side. With each pulse of the light, her mouth opened wider, a silent, guttural scream. Her eyes fixed on Elias, accusing. Her translucent hands strained against the restraints, her fingers elongated, reaching. Elias stumbled back, pressing himself against the doorframe, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just residual haunting. This was an active, agonizing replay of suffering forced upon him by the pulsing light. The whispers in the corridor outside intensified, now a desperate chorus of "Leave! Leave! He comes!" The gurgling sound returned, closer now, echoing from the corridor he had just left. It wasn't just the memory of suffering, it was a prelude. The creature from the hydrotherapy room was coming, it had followed him. He had walked into a trap. The operating theater, illuminated by its grotesque, pulsing light, felt like a stage set for his own demise. He was soaked, shivering, weaponless save for a small knife, surrounded by spectral agony, and the unseen, gurgling monstrosity was closing in. As the pulsing light illuminated the woman on the table, her head snapped forward, her hollow eyes locking onto Elias. Her lips moved, though no sound escaped, forming a single horrifying word that resonated in his mind as clearly as if she had screamed it aloud. "Run." Then, from the darkness behind him, the distinct clink of metal on tile, followed by the wet squelch. The gurgling intensified, and a heavy, ragged breath sighed in the air directly behind him. The very air grew heavy, oppressive, thick with the scent of old blood, and something else, something metallic and acrid, like ozone and raw fear. Elias felt a cold, wet presence loom over him, a towering shadow that blotted out the already dim light from the operating theater. He felt a faint, hot breath on the back of his neck, smelling of decay and stagnant water. He dared not turn. He couldn't. His mind screamed for him to move, to flee, but his body was frozen, caught between the spectral horrors of the operating room and the terror at his back. He was trapped. Part 4. The breath on Elias's neck was a searing brand, hot and fetid, smelling of decay and stagnant water. It was the breath of the thing from the hydrotherapy room, the gurgling monstrosity that had followed him through the labyrinthine corridors of Blackwood Asylum. He was frozen, pinned between the spectral horrors of the operating theater, where the pulsing light illuminated silent screams, and the terrifying, wet presence at his back. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, but his muscles refused to obey, locked in an agonizing rictus of fear. The spectral woman on the operating table, her hollow eyes still locked on him, contorted her face in a silent plea, her lips forming the word "run" again, a desperate, echoing command in his mind. But it was too late. A cold, impossibly long finger, slick with moisture, brushed against his ear, sending a jolt of pure ice through his spine. The gurgling intensified, a wet, guttural symphony of hunger and anticipation. He felt a pressure on his shoulder, a heavy, wet weight that began to drag him backward, away from the flickering light, deeper into the suffocating darkness of the corridor. He thrashed, a desperate, animalistic cry tearing from his throat, his small utility knife still clutched in his numb hand. He swung it wildly, blindly, feeling the blade connect with nothing but air, then a sickening thud against something impossibly hard, like stone or dense bone. A guttural snarl ripped through the gurgling, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, and the pressure on his shoulder intensified, crushing. The spectral figures in the operating theater flickered more violently now, their silent screams amplifying the terror. The pulsing light bulb above them swung erratically, casting grotesque, shifting shadows that seemed to dance with malicious glee. The woman on the table seemed to be dissolving, fading in and out of existence, her final moments of agony replayed on an endless loop. Elias was dragged backward, pulled away from the doorway, out of the reach of the faint, maddening light. The darkness clamped down again, absolute and suffocating. He kicked, fought, but the creature's grip was relentless, its strength overwhelming. He felt himself being lifted, his feet dangling uselessly. The world spun, a dizzying kaleidoscope of black, and the whispers of the tormented patient swirled around him, a mournful dirge. He takes all of us. The darkness consumes. You are already gone. He was carried, not walking, but floated, through what felt like an endless series of winding corridors, the creature's gurgling breath a constant, chilling presence beside his ear. The clink-scrape of the dragged contraption, the child-sized chair, echoed behind them, a macabre procession. The air grew colder, wetter, thicker, with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and electrical, like burnt wires and ozone. His head swam. He felt himself slipping, the edges of reality blurring. He tried to focus, to fight the encroaching darkness, but the terror was too profound, the experience too surreal. He was being taken deeper into Blackwood, into its ancient, festering heart. Suddenly, the creature stopped. Elias was lowered gently, almost reverently, to his feet. His legs, stiff and shaking, buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto a cold, wet floor. He could hear the creature standing over him, its gurgling breath heavy in the silence. The clink-scrape of the chair ceased, indicating it had been placed beside him. Then a faint, sickly green light began to emanate from somewhere above him, a dull, pervasive glow that slowly, agonizingly illuminated his surroundings. It was a cavernous space, unlike any he had seen in the asylum thus far. The walls were not concrete or brick, but raw, unhewn rock, slick with moisture and covered in a phosphorescent green moss that pulsed with the eerie light. Water dripped from stalactites overhead, falling into unseen pools below, with a hollow, echoing plink. In the center of this grotto, carved directly into the living rock, was a massive, circular pit. Its edges glowed with the same sickly green light, hinting at an unfathomable depth. And around the pit, arranged in a grotesque tableau, were rows of the same metal contraptions Elias had seen earlier, the chair-like restraints, each one facing the abyss, each one empty, except for one. The child-sized chair, the one the creature had dragged, was positioned directly at the edge of the pit, and on it, slumped and small, was the figure Elias had glimpsed. Not a doll, but a child, or what remained of one. The child was translucent, shimmering faintly in the green light, like the specters in the operating theater. Its head was bowed, its tiny hands bound by brittle leather straps. It was a girl, no older than 8, her long, dark hair matted and tangled. As Elias watched, horrified, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her translucent body. The creature stood beside the child, its impossibly tall, gaunt frame casting long, wavering shadows on the moss-covered walls. It was entirely visible now in the eerie light. Its skin was not merely wet, but seemed composed of dark, glistening rock, like polished obsidian, with veins of the same pulsing green light running beneath the surface. Its limbs were too long, too thin, jointed at grotesque angles. Its head was indeed shrunken, but its gaping maw, filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth, was horribly distended. Its eyes, those pinprick points of malevolence, glowed with an internal emerald fire. And then Elias saw the chains. Thick, rusty chains were wrapped around the creature's wrists and ankles, disappearing into the floor, into the very rock itself. It was bound, constrained within this subterranean chamber. Yet it had been able to drag the child's chair, and it had been able to reach for him. The realization sent a fresh wave of terror through him. Its reach, despite its bonds, was far greater than he had imagined. The creature lowered its head, its razor-sharp teeth bared, in what could only be described as a grotesque, silent smile. The gurgling sound intensified, a low, rumbling hum that resonated deep within Elias's chest, a sound that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in his bones. Suddenly, the green light intensified, pulsing with greater urgency. The air grew colder, the whispers around him rising to a frenzied, desperate crescendo. The spectral child on the chair trembled violently, her small head beginning to lift. Elias, still on the floor, could only watch in horrified fascination. He saw it then, in the center of the pit, beneath the swirling green mist that now began to rise from its depths. Not just an empty void, but a dark, swirling vortex of pure, inky blackness, like a bottomless well of solidified shadow. And from this abyss, a deep, resonant thrum emanated, growing louder, more insistent, vibrating through the cavern. The creature extended one impossibly long obsidian finger, pointing it directly at Elias. Its glowing emerald eyes fixed on him, a predatory glint within their depths.
And then, for the first time, it spoke, not in a gurgle, but in a voice that was both ancient and modern, a chilling whisper that echoed through the cavern, seeming to emanate from the very rock walls. It was Elias's own voice, distorted, twisted, yet undeniably his. You are the sacrifice. Elias stared, utterly bewildered, utterly terrified. His own voice. The words ripped through him, shredding the last vestiges of his sanity. He was the sacrifice? For what? For whom? The spectral child on the chair finally lifted her head, her eyes, empty and black, fixed on Elias. Her translucent lips moved, and a voice, hollow and ethereal, whispered, "He has waited for the perfect vessel."
The swirling vortex in the pit began to churn faster, pulling at the air, at the very fabric of reality. The thrumming from its depths intensified, becoming a deafening roar. The green light pulsed wildly, illuminating the horror of the scene. The creature, the obsidian man, began to move, its chains rattling, dragging the child's chair closer to the edge of the pit, then turning its glowing eyes back to Elias. Elias felt an invisible force pulling at him, tugging him towards the swirling abyss. He fought it, clawing at the wet rock floor, but it was relentless, inexorable. He was being drawn, slowly, agonizingly, towards the gaping maw of darkness. The whispers were a deafening shriek now, not of warning, but of triumph and despair.
He looked back at the obsidian creature, its grotesque face illuminated by the green light. It was no longer just a monster. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting, bound for an opportunity. And Elias, the curious journalist, had delivered himself directly into its clutches. The thrumming from the pit became a roar, a hungry, sucking sound, as the vortex began to pull at his very soul. He was not merely being dragged towards a physical pit. He was being drawn into something far more ancient, far more terrifying. His purpose here was not to document, but to become the vessel. Part 5. The invisible force pulling Elias toward the churning abyss in the grotto's center became overwhelming. He dug his fingers into the slick, moss-covered rock, clawing desperately, but his grip was useless against the inexorable pull. The thrumming from the pit escalated into a deafening roar, a hungry, sucking sound that resonated in his teeth, his skull, his very core. The sickly green light pulsed with blinding intensity, casting grotesque, dancing shadows of the obsidian creature and the spectral child across the cavern walls.
The obsidian man, its emerald eyes burning with an ancient fire, watched him, a grotesque smile stretching its distended maw. Its chains, anchored deep within the rock, rattled with anticipation, a rhythmic clang that seemed to beat in time with Elias's own frantic heart. The spectral child, still slumped in the chair, its empty eyes fixed on Elias, now began to shimmer violently, its translucent form flickering, dissolving at the edges. "He has waited for the perfect vessel," the child's ethereal voice echoed, a mournful whisper carried on the roaring wind from the pit. "The veil thins, the confluence. You are the key." Elias was dragged closer, inch by agonizing inch, towards the circular maw of pure, inky blackness. He could feel the cold, moist air rushing past him, drawn into the vortex. The roar was no longer just a sound, but a physical force, tearing at his clothes, at his skin, threatening to strip him bare. He glimpsed the depth of the pit, a swirling void that seemed to consume light itself, a gateway to something utterly alien and terrifying. Just as his feet dangled over the edge of the abyss, a sudden blinding flash erupted from within the pit, a burst of searing white light that momentarily eclipsed the green glow of the moss. The roar intensified, becoming a primal shriek that vibrated through the rock, through Elias's very being, shaking the cavern to its foundations. The obsidian creature recoiled slightly, a low growl of anticipation rumbling in its chest. And then, from the heart of the vortex, a voice spoke. It was not the obsidian man's distorted mimicry, nor the child's ethereal whisper. This voice was ancient, vast, and terrible, a chorus of 1,000 drowned souls, yet singular in its intent. It spoke in a language Elias had never heard, yet understood perfectly, a language of pure thought, of raw primal fear. Finally, the confluence is complete, the vessel is ready. The words exploded in Elias's mind, not heard through his ears, but imprinted directly onto his consciousness. They brought with them a wave of cosmic despair, an understanding of a malevolent intelligence that transcended time and space, something that had been dormant, bound within Blackwood, waiting for this moment. The child in the chair, her spectral form now almost entirely dissolved, flickered one last time, her lips parting as she released a single silent tear, a final act of ethereal anguish before she vanished completely, leaving only the empty, rusted chair at the pit's edge. The invisible force yanked Elias forward, over the lip of the abyss. He tumbled into the swirling blackness, a choked scream tearing from his throat. The fall was not a physical descent, but a plunge into an infinite void, a dissolution of self. He felt his body unraveling, atom by atom, his consciousness stretching, distorting, expanding into something vast and terrifying. Images flashed through his mind, not memories, but alien visions, crumbling civilizations under alien stars, oceans of primordial slime, the silent, watching eyes of entities beyond human comprehension. He saw the obsidian creature, not as a monster, but as a warden, a keeper of this terrible secret, bound by ancient pacts, patiently waiting for the confluence, for the release of its true master. He understood then that the experimental therapies of Blackwood Asylum, the disappearances, the suffering, were not mere human cruelty, but a deliberate, methodical process of cultivating despair, of thinning the veil, of preparing the ground for something to cross over. And he was the final component. He felt a searing pain, not physical, but existential, as if his very soul was being flayed open. He was not dying, he was being remade. His individuality was eroding, dissolving into the vast, hungry consciousness that now flowed into him from the pit. He was becoming a conduit, a vessel, a doorway. A final, desperate spark of Elias Thorne, the journalist, flickered.
He tried to resist, to push back against the consuming darkness, to remember who he was, what he had come for. But the memories were fading, replaced by cold, alien knowledge, by a boundless hunger. Then, just as his essence threatened to fully merge, he felt a strange internal shift, a cold, familiar weight in his hand, the utility knife.
It had been with him all along, clutched in his grasp, a small anchor to his former self. In a final, desperate act of defiance, not against the creature, but against the cosmic horror that sought to possess him, he plunged the cold steel into nothing, into his own dissolving essence, into the swirling void that was becoming him. A shriek, vast and terrible, tore through the cavern, not from Elias, but from the pit itself. The blinding white light intensified, a searing agony that ripped through Elias's dissolving form. The roar became a sound of pure agony, not triumph. The confluence was broken, the vessel was damaged. The invisible force reversed violently. Elias was hurled upward out of the pit, his body reforming with agonizing speed, flesh and bones snapping back into place, memories rushing back in a dizzying, painful torrent. He landed hard on the slick rock floor, coughing, gasping, his body aching, his mind reeling. He lay there, stunned, soaked, shivering, unable to move. The white light from the pit receded, replaced by the sickly green glow of the moss. The monstrous roar faded, replaced by a low, furious growl from the obsidian creature. He slowly pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the cavern. The pit still churned, but the vortex within was calmer, less intense, no longer drawing him in. The obsidian creature, however, was no longer merely observing. It was enraged. Its emerald eyes blazed with a terrifying, frustrated fury. It pulled at its chains, a low, guttural shriek tearing from its distended maw, its impossibly long limbs straining against its bonds. It lunged towards him, its movements restricted, yet powerful, its sharp teeth bared. Elias stumbled backward, crawling, then stumbling to his feet. He had failed the entity in the pit. He had damaged the vessel. And the warden, the obsidian creature, was coming for him. Its chains rattled, scraping against the rock as it dragged itself forward, a terrifying, relentless pursuit. He turned and fled, not knowing where he was going, only that he had to escape this place. He scrambled back through the winding corridors, the gurgling growl of the obsidian creature echoing behind him, now coupled with the clanking of its chains as it tore itself free, or at least loosened its bonds enough to pursue him. The whispers of the tortured patients were no longer mournful, but frantic, panicked, a legion of voices urging him on, or perhaps screaming in terror at the creature's unleashed fury. He burst out of the asylum, back into the perpetual twilight of the surrounding forest. The air, though cold and damp, felt like a blessed relief after the suffocating horrors within. He ran, not looking back, the sounds of the asylum fading behind him, replaced by the frantic pounding of his own heart, the rasp of his ragged breath. He reached his truck, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely insert it into the ignition. He cranked the engine. It roared to life, a sound of glorious mechanical triumph. He slammed the transmission into reverse, spun the truck around, and tore down the neglected track, away from Blackwood Asylum, away from the obsidian creature, away from the pit. He drove for hours until the gray, bruised sky of Blackwood gave way to the pale, uncertain dawn of the outside world. He pulled over on the side of a deserted highway, his body trembling uncontrollably, his mind a fractured landscape of horror and impossible memory. He looked at his hands. They were scraped and bruised, but otherwise normal. No lingering wetness, no obsidian sheen. He was whole. He was alive. But was he?
He reached for the recorder clipped to his jacket. The tiny red light was still glowing. He pressed play. The first few minutes were his own voice, calm and professional, narrating his observations. Then came the chilling sounds, the creak of the gate, the drip, 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 the whispers, the gurgling, the clinking chains, and then his own voice, twisted and alien, echoing from the depths of the grotto. "You are the sacrifice." Followed by the spectral child's chilling pronouncement, "He has waited for the perfect vessel." Elias listened, his blood running cold, to the cacophony of his own terror, the screams, the gurgles, the roar of the pit.
And then, at the very end, just before the recording cut out, a faint, almost subliminal sound emerged from the depths of the ambient horror. It was a low, wet gurgle, not the monster's gurgle, but something else, something closer, something inside the recording itself. And then a whisper, faint and distorted, yet undeniably clear, emanating from the speaker of the recorder, a voice that was both his own and utterly alien. "The confluence is not broken." Elias dropped the recorder. It shattered on the asphalt. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that would never leave him. He was out of Blackwood, but Blackwood was not out of him. He was a damaged vessel, yes, but a vessel nonetheless. And the pit, the entity, was still within, waiting. The Obsidian Veil had been breached, and something had followed him out.